In the episode right before this one, I handed you the exact system that we use here at Pod Launch to help me stay a month ahead on content creation here for the podcast and still follow inspiration when it hits, so that you can always make sure that you have time on your calendar blocked off for the creative aspect of your podcast, and so that you can actually enjoy the process of creating that content. But what about when life hits and something comes up? Because inevitably, you know that it will. You know that there will be times when you have nothing batched, and when that episode needs to go out and you're like, I'm drawing a blank, I got nothing. This episode is going to be your fallback plan for those times. I'm literally going to hand you 8 ideas that you can plug and play whenever you need to create content in a bind, so that you don't have a gap in your production schedule, so that you don't have to risk losing the trust of your audience, and so that you don't break your track record of publishing a new episode every week. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Chances are, if you listen to this podcast, it's because you want to grow a top podcast of your own. And if you want to grow a top podcast, and if you want that podcast to actually generate revenue and convert listeners to clients or attract aligned sponsors, then the prerequisite to that, the thing that you need to have in place first, is listener trust. One of the ways we can quickly erode that trust is when we don't show up as expected. So this is why you hear people in the podcasting space harping on consistency and why that's so important. And it is important. Is it the key to a top podcast? No. It is one cog of a very big machine. It is one small wheel of all the gears that turn towards getting you into the top 100 and ultimately being seen as that thought leader, that binge-worthy thought leader, that go-to expert in your niche. So my personal philosophy on this is that the show must go on. And if I need to take a step back, if something happens in my life where I do genuinely need to take a step back from the podcast, then I need to figure out a way for the show to go on while I step back. So the big question here is, well, how can you keep the show going in a way that would genuinely serve your listeners in your absence without it creating a ton of extra work for you? What if you could keep your listeners engaged by repurposing some of your best content? And here's where we have to just think outside the box and begin to ask ourselves questions like, well, what if I could keep my listeners engaged by going back and looking for my top performing episodes and repurposing those or remastering those, looking for that best performing content and resharing it on the podcast? Maybe you could release highlight episodes that feature top moments or key takeaways from previous episodes. You could literally rerun previous episodes. Think of how many TV networks do this, and yet they still rack up the views. I've done this with previous episodes. Some of our best performing episodes, I have taken and remastered those and reshared them on the podcast, because guess what? If they were that good, people listening now are still going to find value in it. In fact, you probably have more new listeners now than when that episode first aired, and not everyone hears all of your content. So if it was that good, then sharing it again will provide value to your audience. Can I create some episode highlights? Can I create an episode with highlights that feature top moments or takeaways from previous episodes around a central theme? Okay, that fills a gap. Maybe you could do a listener Q&A around a central theme. You could elicit questions from your audience and say, hey, I want to do a Q&A episode on this topic or this topic. What questions do you have that I could answer for you? And you could create episodes that way. Sometimes having that external input can be a really great starting off point where it's not like, this content has to be pulled out of your brain. You're just answering a question for your listeners. And it can help the creation piece of that content go a lot faster, and you'll be a lot more in flow when creating that content. Another thing you could do is to create a bite-sized episode series that you air over a specific window of time. One summer, I'll never forget this. My son was really little and he was home all summer. Like, he was too little to go to camp. There were no camps that would take a kid that young. I think he was like 2 or 3. And so he was home with me. I had podcast episodes to get out, and I'm like, how am I going to do this? Because literally having a toddler running around your house when you're trying to record podcast episodes, it's not really conducive to the audio environment that I really wanted to create on the podcast. So what I decided to do was I decided to plan out a bite-sized episode series that would allow me to record really short, really targeted episodes around a specific topic, and then to make those episodes part of a series so that it wasn't just all of a sudden like these little 5-minute episodes coming out on the podcast, but so that I actually quote unquote sold that series as, hey, here's this mini series that's going to help you do X, Y, Z. I can't even remember what it was at the time because it was so long ago and it wasn't related to podcasting. This was when my podcast was like a very general business podcast. But the idea of it really helped. It really helped me to get through that season where I didn't have the time or the bandwidth to create these longer, in-depth episodes, but I could do a series around a specific topic, which actually helped to increase the bingeability of those episodes, because not only were they shorter, but they were centered around a specific topic that each one built upon the one before it. So this is a really great idea when you have a season that you know, hey, it's going to be a couple of weeks before I can get back to creating content on the podcast like I'm used to, or I'm about to go through a season where, I need a month's worth of content. This is a great fallback plan to have in your back pocket. And you can let your listeners know, like, hey, over the next 4 episodes, I'm going to be walking you step by step through XYZ so that you can ABC. And like I said, this creates bingeability because it's these mini episodes centered around a topic that your listeners want to know about. And they're going to want to get to the next one to learn all the steps or all the facets of whatever it is that you're teaching. So the key with this is just to be sure that if you're doing any kind of like bite-sized series or episode series centered around a topic, that you're opening loops at the end of each episode. Because the idea here is to lighten the content creation load for you, but also keep your listeners engaged and keep them listening. So this can be a really great way to do that and keep them hooked episode to episode. Another thing you can do if you teach any kind of content outside of your podcast is to repurpose segments from your course or from your programs. There have been times, ask anyone that has worked within our company, there have been times where I've said, look, go through my course, go through the program, find some of the stuff that you feel like would be so relevant for our listeners on our show, and let's turn that into an episode. And I recorded an intro and an outro, and we gave the meat of the episode right there, and it was straight from our program. You don't want to give everything away, of course, because then people won't have a reason to work with you, but pulling out pieces and parts and giving context around that and sharing that with your audience can be a very valuable way to create desire for whatever it is you teach inside your full program. You could also repurpose interviews that you've done on other podcasts that would be relevant to your audience. I've done all of these things. The key is doing it in a way that's engaging, because the moment you tell people, hey, I'm tired of creating content, I'm burnt out, so enjoy this repurposed content, you lose them. Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to be like, oh, you're burnt out, so you're just going to give us repurposed content? Great, I'm out. No, you want to do it in a way that's engaging. So in a season maybe where your content is rolling and flowing and you feel connected and in flow, maybe consider batching above and beyond, when you can create a few short evergreen episodes that you can have in the bank that can be released at any time. These kind of emergency episodes are really great to have in your back pocket because they can fill a gap whenever you need a break. Or you can implement any one or all of the above ideas that I just gave you. In our regular batching schedule, I aim to be a month ahead of all times. Am I a month ahead at all times? No. But I aim to be a month ahead of all times. Why? Because it takes the pressure off of me of having to create content. And in those moments where maybe I'm not batched ahead, or where something happens like a hurricane, or my son is sick, or school closes for whatever random reason, and I don't have the bandwidth to record a new episode that week, these are some of the strategies that I use, not only to repurpose and reshare some of the content that did really well and give that content more exposure, but also to keep the consistency up with the podcast and to never let there be any gaps in our release schedule, because I want to keep our audience trained to expect that content from me here on this platform that I am building and sharing this content with you every week. I want you to be able to come here every week and get something new from me. And even if it's not brand new, maybe to hear it again, because maybe you'll pick up something new from it. But on the flip side of that, if your workload is just really overwhelming right now, and you're like, I can't even think about anything right now, then consider getting some help. Consider having your VA go through your course or your program and maybe pull out some content that you could share. It would not cost you a lot of money, and it would save you a ton of time. Also, go back in your analytics. Look at your best performing content from 6 months ago, 2 or a year ago. Re-record that intro and outro. Repackage it, reintroduce it, and replay it. It does take a little bit of strategy and planning, but when you break it down to, okay, how much time am I taking off? How many episodes does that work out to be? And what do I need to do to fill those gaps that would require minimal prep time, but allow me to keep the content rolling? What this is going to do is it's going to protect your momentum. It's going to protect the traction you've built. It's going to protect the relationship with the audience that you have. And it's going to keep your listeners engaged without you necessarily needing to go out there and batch a ton of new content. And it'll keep your feed active, which is really important, and signals to players like Apple and Spotify that you have an active and engaged podcast with an active and engaged audience. And it's going to remind your listeners of the value that you provide. And maybe even attract new listeners who miss some of those gems the first time around. But what about on the flip side? What about if an emergency happens and you really do need to take a step back from the show? If you need a longer break, we're talking longer than 90 days. What I want you to do is I want you to look at your podcast like Netflix. What do they do when they end a season and drop a new one? How can you replicate this with your show? So one of the ways to do this is you can plan a structured hiatus. And what you'll want to do if you are literally going to take a step back and not publish any episodes, then first you have to recognize that there's going to be some listener attrition. You will lose some listeners. Now, if you can make peace with that, then what I recommend you doing is bring your listeners into the conversation and announce a clear return date and create content around that return date. See what you can do to keep your audience engaged, maybe on other platforms like email newsletters or social media updates. But build some structure into the hiatus so that listeners know what to expect. This will help you protect the trust that they've developed with you, the host. Another thing you could do is arrange for a series of guest hosts to come and fill the gap. This is a really creative, out-of-the-box, forward way of thinking. But if you have a niche podcast and there are guest hosts that you can bring in and you can have those hosts record those episodes that you air over that span of time, that could be a great way to keep momentum going. Or maybe at least keep it going for a little bit and then tack on that structured hiatus. There are a lot of ways that you can structure a longer break. And maybe you can make the break a little shorter. Maybe you could also just increase the communication around the break you're taking. So as always, so that at the forefront, you're protecting that listener trust. You're doing everything you can to protect that trust. Another thing that you can do, and a lot of times this will work better from the onset than it does later on in the game, but you could create a seasonal approach to your podcast. You could literally plan your podcast out in seasons, which kind of gives you a bit of a built-in break in between. And you can just frame this as part of your show's structure so that listeners know what to expect. Now, if you do this, again, you'll have that listener attrition, but at least people know what to expect. Those who are most loyal will likely come back. This format does work for a lot of podcasts. If it works for Netflix, if it works for true crime podcasts, then why can't it work for yours too? Typically in the space, a business podcast, a marketing podcast, an educational type of podcast, those types of podcasts, people tend to expect that content at least weekly, at a minimum every single week. But there are other types of podcasts that have this seasonal format. And the key to doing the seasonal format, particularly if you don't have a podcast that would typically have this kind of seasonal approach, like a true crime podcast, what you want to be really intentional with is opening loops and creating hooks and getting really good at training people to come back, giving them a reason to come back and never letting the break be too long that too much time has passed. Now you look like a dead podcast and nobody's coming back. So hopefully this gives you a ton of ideas and gets your wheels turning for how you can be creative when it comes to taking a step back from your podcast if you need it. Because the reality is we are human. There are going to be times and seasons in our life and in our business where we do need that creative break and we need to recharge those creative juices. So these ideas can help you either A, keep the momentum going and take a step back without losing any of the momentum that you've built, while you continue to serve your audience with content, even if you're not actively producing that content in a real-time sort of way, or if you genuinely need to take a step back, and it's going to be a long step back. Well, maybe there's some things you can do to help minimize the amount of time that you're stepping back. And then if all else fails, plan a structured hiatus around the show and announce a clear return date so that your listeners know what to expect. So there you go. These are 8 ideas that you can use and pull out of your back pocket anytime you need to create content in a pinch. And what this is going to help you do, at least my hope, is that it will help you lighten your load whenever you need it and or whenever you have nothing batched. Because ideally, if you listen to the episode before this one, you want to make sure that you are staying ahead on your content creation at all times and that you've got space blocked out for it on your calendar, because otherwise it is going to become a chore. It is going to be difficult to keep up with. And at some point, you're going to hate the process of podcasting and you're going to want to give up. But when 80 to 90% of the time you are ahead on your content creation, that gives you buffer room for when life happens. So that these 8 ideas are really just as needed whenever truly life happens and you don't have something batched the next week. Because that's happened to me before too, where it's like, oh my gosh, I had 8 episodes batched. And then of course, before I move into my next batching cycle, that's the moment that life decides to happen. And then it's like, well, what about that week? Because I was going to batch that week and now I can't. So these ideas are for those moments. And if you found this helpful, I would love it if you would let other new potential listeners know simply by tapping the 5 stars in your app and leaving a written review so that when new listeners find this show for the first time, they can trust that it's going to be worth their time. And speaking of earning new listeners' trust, did you know that 80% of actually doing that, actually earning that trust of your listener, happens before they ever hit play on a single episode? The other 20% of earning that trust is built through the content that you're delivering and making sure that content delivers on what you're promising and through the consistency of your episodes. But that 80% is so key to converting first-time listeners, cold listeners who do not know you yet, who have never heard your voice before, who don't have a recommendation for your podcast. It is key to converting them. Because if they're not converting, or you're not converting as many as you should be, it's going to be really tough to grow your show. Listeners need to see social proof that other people trust your show. So reviews obviously is like the best and most visible way to do that. But Spotify just rolled out a brand new feature on their platform, which kind of functions similar to likes on Instagram or TikTok or any other of these social media platforms that we're used to. Because, quote, according to Spotify, we want to give creators a deeper understanding of how content resonates with audiences. But I think that's a load of you-know-what. And in the next episode, I am breaking down exactly what you need to know about this metric, why this new metric is not going to give you any new insight whatsoever into the true health of your podcast, and what you should focus on instead if you want to have a true understanding of how your content is resonating with your audience. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.